Hello and greetings, Earthlings. This is Dr. Mandic from William Patterson University, and welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. This is lecture 18, another lecture in our God unit, and a lot of what we've been talking about so far have been arguments for the existence of God, but now we're going to talk about a famous argument against the existence of God. It's an argument for atheism, and this argument often gets called the argument from evil, although it might be more informative to call it the argument from pain or the argument from suffering. And sometimes this general line of thought gets called the problem of evil. So even if you believed in the existence of God, there's still this problem that you have to solve as a philosopher who believes in the existence of God, and that is, how can God exist in a universe that also has evil in it, or more specifically, a universe that has suffering in it, a universe that has pain in it. So that's the problem of pain, or the problem of evil, or the problem of suffering. It's all the same problem. Here's just a little refresher from lecture 16 about the key definitions that we're interested in. And the one that really matters for this lecture is this definition of atheism. It's the belief that God does not exist. And this argument that we're examining, the argument from evil, is an argument against the existence of God. It's an argument for atheism, an argument for the belief that God does not exist, that there is no God. One famous source of this line of thought is Hume. Hume is someone that keeps coming up in these lectures, and here's Hume's formulation of the problem of evil. So here's a quote from Hume. Hume says, "Is he," and he is God, "is he willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God?" That is a really well-written way of putting the problem of evil. And probably you could take that yourself and figure out what the argument is supposed to be, like rearrange the ideas here so that it's spelled out explicitly as an argument. And if you did that, you'd probably come up with something that looks like this. So we've got an argument here, and the argument has a form. There's a form to the argument, and one of the things that we could see is that the logical form of the argument is one in which this is going to be a valid argument. This argument is valid, and that's a technical term from logic. And what it means for an argument to be valid is it's the sort of logical form such that if the premises were all true, then the conclusion would have to be true. So, if it's true that if God exists, then no suffering exists, and it's also true that suffering does exist, it just follows logically that God would not exist. So the argument is valid. Case closed. Have we proven atheism? No. Just because the argument is valid doesn't mean it's automatically sound. What it means for an argument to be sound is for the argument to be both valid and also to have all true premises. And there maybe are some questions you could raise about whether the premises are true. So suppose you were a theist, and a lot of what you should be thinking about in listening to this lecture and evaluating these arguments is you should be thinking of this as a debate between specifically the theist and the atheist, a debate between someone who believes that God exists and someone else who believes that God does not exist. And the atheist starts the debate off with the argument from evil. And imagine now that you are the theist and you do believe that God exists. What criticisms might you come up with of the atheist's argument? You're not going to gain any traction by saying that the argument is invalid. It's clearly a valid argument, and any logician would grant that it's a valid argument. If you're going to make any progress, you're going to do it by trying to show that one or both of the premises are false. So let's start with the easy one, premise 2. suffering does exist. Now, if you wanted to defend the existence of God against the argument from evil, you might just try to argue that suffering doesn't exist. If suffering doesn't exist, then you can't blame God for it. Or I mean, there's just no question of the problem of evil. Problem solved. There's no evil. There's no suffering. There's no pain. Now that's kind of hard to take seriously. I stubbed my toe really badly yesterday, and I've got this like terrible bruise on it, and it still kind of hurts. Obviously, it's just obvious to me that suffering exists, and that's kind of a trite example. There's just horrible, horrible suffering in the world, and it would be deeply offensive to deny that there are people suffering in just really egregious ways, way beyond simply getting a stubbed toe. There's all sorts of suffering all over the place. Innocent children dying for no reason at all from horrible, horrible, horrible illnesses, horrible injustices, warfare that affects the lives of many, many innocent people, innocent children, weird just accidents, freak accidents that are hurting people in large, terrible, terrible ways, killing people, the suffering that is caused by the survivors that suffer in mourning of the loved ones that they lost. So it seems really very difficult to deny that there's suffering, although sometimes you are exposed to the view that maybe suffering is an illusion, that if you are able to achieve a certain state of mind, you can penetrate that illusion and see that real reality is filled with bliss, but that there's not really any real pain. That's kind of hard to take. I mean, there's a sense in which pain might be an illusion, in that pain is an appearance, pain is a mental state, it's an appearance that things are bad. Now, and maybe things aren't bad, things are intrinsically blissful. Nonetheless, if you were in that mental state, there would still be suffering. One way to put it is that if pain is an illusion, the illusion still exists, right? So suppose you had an illusion that there was a pink elephant in the room, and we prove that there isn't a pink elephant in the room. But the illusion still exists. The appearance in your mind, or the idea of the pink elephant, still exists, right? So one thing people might mean when they say pain is an illusion is that pain is an idea. But that wouldn't prove that pain doesn't exist. It just proves that pain is mental. It has a mental existence. So it's very hard, even if you embrace the view that pain is an illusion, it's very hard to reject premise two. It seems that there's an enormous amount of suffering, large and small, in the universe. So really, if you're going to make any traction as a theist trying to oppose the argument from evil, trying to oppose the atheist's attempt to disprove God, your best bet is to try to think of objections to this first premise. And the first premise is very interesting. The first premise is an if-then statement. It is saying, if God exists, then no suffering exists. You might wonder, well, why is that supposed to be true? And is the reasoning that justifies why that's supposed to be true, is that something that we might call into question? Let's say a little bit on behalf of the atheist. Like, why is the first premise supposed to be true? And we've mentioned this a little bit in an earlier lecture when we were talking about definitions of the existence of God. So one of the classic definitions of the existence of God says that God is all loving, and God is all powerful, and God is all knowing, and God is the creator of the universe. And another definition of the existence of God says that God is an infinitely perfect being, which is spelled out as saying that for every good property, God has that property, and for every good property that comes in degrees, God has it to the maximal degree. So so like having sympathy for people that are suffering, that's a good thing, and God has that. And further, He has it a lot. He has it to the greatest possible capacity. So I might have a little bit of sympathy for my friends, right? So if my friend broke their leg, I would feel bad for them. But what if my friend had a painful zit? I might be like, whatever. It's not that big of a deal, dude. Broken leg, yeah, I feel bad for you, but a mildly uh, itchy mosquito bite, like, I might not even think about it. But if I was infinitely loving, I would I would be bothered by everyone's suffering, no matter how much suffering we're talking about. So if I was infinitely loving, I wouldn't want you to have a painful zit. Not only would I not want you to have a broken leg, I wouldn't want you to have the painful zit. I wouldn't want you to have the mildly itchy mosquito bite either. Why? Because I'm infinitely loving. I wouldn't want anybody to have any suffering if I was infinitely loving. And you might say, that's weird. Like, how can you expect anyone to be infinitely loving? And the answer is, because they're God. That's why. We're not just talking about some average person. Maybe an average person doesn't have the mental capacity to have that much love. But by definition, God is supposed to have infinite positive qualities. So it has the capacity to have that much sympathy. And not just for some beings, but for all beings. Even if there was an infinite number of creatures, God would have love for all of them. Um, so that means perhaps anybody that's able to suffer, maybe not just humans, but dogs, cats, dolphins, maybe earthworms can suffer. Anybody that's capable of suffering, an infinitely loving being would be bothered by that. They wouldn't want those beings to suffer, not even a little bit. So God is omnibenevolent, means God loves, and he loves everybody, and he loves them to the greatest degree, and that means he doesn't want them to have any suffering whatsoever. This is the reasoning of the atheist. Now, you might say you don't like some of this, but we'll get to that later. What else can we say about God? Well, part of the definition of God is that God is all powerful. God can do any logically possible thing. If it's logically possible for you to have less suffering than you have right now, then God could make that happen. If it's logically possible for you to not have a painful zit, then God can make sure you never have a painful zit. If it's logically possible for you to never stub your toe, then God can make sure that you never stub your toe. If it's logically possible for there to be no hurricanes that wipe out entire neighborhoods, for there to never be a war that causes any innocent children to be injured or killed, then God can make sure that that's the way things go down. He's all powerful. Every logically possible thing he's able to do. So now, if for all logically possible suffering reduction, being omnibenevolent, he'd be motivated to reduce that suffering. For every logically possible suffering elimination, God would be able to eliminate that. Another thing, God's the creator, so that means God would create a world that didn't have any suffering in the first place. He wouldn't just be some superhero that swoops in and makes the suffering stop. He's the creator of the whole thing, so he would make sure that it didn't exist in the first place. And if there was anything that was going to lead to any suffering, he would know about that ahead of time. Why? Because he knows everything. He's all-knowing. So the definition of God is supposed to give you the support for the first premise. That's why it's supposed to be true that if God exists, then no suffering exists. But now let's turn things over to the theist. What could the theist say against this first premise? Why might it be possible for God to exist even though some suffering exists? If that's possible, if it's possible, logically possible for God to exist even though there's some suffering, then this first premise would be false and the whole argument would be shown to be unsound. In the history of these discussions, there's three main objections that the theist comes up with against the argument from evil, specifically against that first premise. And a lot of these objections are objections that you would think of on your own. Even if you didn't do the reading, you would have thought of this on your own, at least some of them. One of the most famous ones is the free will objection. So the theist says, well, here's why the first premise isn't true. Here's why it is true that God could exist and there be some suffering. And it goes like this. God, being all good, gave humanity free will, and free will is itself a good. Now, part of having free will is that you have the freedom to choose evil. You have the freedom to bring suffering into the world. And that's what happened. And on one version of this, the way it all went down was with Adam and Eve, and they ate the apple, and it just went downhill from there. They used their free will to go against God, and they created all sorts of suffering. Next thing you know, you got Cain and Abel. They're like killing each other and stuff like that. And in general, humanity is a pretty crappy place because a lot of people use their free will to cause suffering in themselves and in others. But God is off the hook. God gave this good thing, which is free will, and people use their free will to choose of their own free choice. They chose, at least in some cases, to do evil, to bring about suffering. So don't blame God, blame the people. So that's the free will objection to this first premise of the argument from evil. That's one of the first things that the theist might object to this premise. Another objection, again, this is popular amongst students when I present this in class. A lot of them come up with something that gets called the soul-making objection. And it says that, well, actually, it's good for you to have some suffering. God is bringing about a good end by letting there be some suffering. One way to put this is like it makes you tougher. It helps you learn things that you otherwise wouldn't learn. Another way of putting it is it helps you appreciate things that you otherwise wouldn't appreciate. So, for example, many of my students, they spent their whole lives in New Jersey, and the weather in New Jersey is not always great. And if you can afford it, you might go on vacation. You might go on vacation to a nice tropical location. But if you grew up in that tropical location, you might not appreciate like how nice it is there. But if you grew up somewhere like in Michigan or Chicago or New Jersey, and you experience like really harsh winters, that really puts you in a position to appreciate like how really, really nice it can be somewhere in the tropics. So you don't appreciate good things unless you are exposed to bad things. And the good things are good, and it's good to experience them as good, and you experience them as good better if you have the contrast case. You're able to experience some bad. So you don't appreciate the sweet unless you get some sour. And then there's this objection, which is a pretty famous objection in the philosophical literature, and it's one that comes from Leibniz. So Leibniz keeps coming up in this class, and here's Leibniz again. And Leibniz says, well, you could have suffering in the world, and God exists, and God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, etc., as long as what God made was the best of all possible worlds. As long as God made the best logically possible world, well, if it turns out that the best logically possible world has a little bit of suffering in it, then that's fine. That's consistent with the existence of God. So God is not obligated to make a world without suffering. What he's obligated to do is to make the best possible world. And maybe, for some reason, the best possible world has a little bit of suffering in it. You don't know, but God knows. So you might say, like, wouldn't it be better if there were no mosquitoes? And, maybe you don't have enough of the big picture, but if you had the big picture, you would realize that the mosquitoes play an important role. The mosquitoes are like the best way to feed a certain kind of fish, which is the best way to feed a certain kind of bear. The bear has all sorts of effects on the ecosystem that come back to you, and you have a much better life. God thought about making a world without mosquitoes in it, but in that world, the fish all died, and the bears all died, and then that had some weird effect, and no one got to drink coffee, ever. And would you really give up coffee if it meant you're going to get to live in a world without mosquitoes? God thought this through and realized that we're all better off if we have coffee. Coffee is absolutely delicious. It's really great first thing in the morning, and it's worth having a few mosquito bites, and also maybe a few people die from like malaria or West Nile virus, whatever. But God's got a plan. Trust God has a plan, and God has the best of all possible worlds. So, this is slightly different from the soul-making objection, but both of them say, like, look, that there's some good that the evil or the suffering helps. and that you wouldn't have that good without it. In the best of all possible worlds objection, it doesn't tell you what the good is. It just says that there has to be some. And as long as there is some, and further, it's the best possible good, then it's okay to have a little bit of suffering in that world. It wouldn't necessitate that God has to not exist if there was some suffering in the world. And the free will objection has a kind of similar flavor to it in that, well, free will is supposed to be a good. And the evil is like a necessary evil. It just comes along for the ride. But you got it. It's just what happens when you have free will. But free will is a good, and God gave us this good. But now, each of these objections, they are different objections despite their similarities. And because of their differences, we're going to see there's different things that the atheist can come back and say. So, like I said before, keep in mind that you can think of all of this as a kind of a debate between the theist and the atheist. And part of what you need to learn, if you want to understand the argument from evil and the debate over it, is to learn what each of the different people arguing could say logically at any given point. So the atheist gives the argument from evil, and the theist gives objections to the first premise. And now what can the atheist say against these objections? So here's a little summary of the theistic objections, and in just a little bit we're going to talk about the atheist's response, but just here's the summary. So the free will objection is the one that says an all-loving God creates free will, and free agents sometimes choose evil. The soul-making objection says suffering promotes spiritual growth. And then the best of all possible worlds objection says an all-loving God creates the best logically possible world, even if that one must have some suffering in it. Okay. So now we get to this question. What atheist responses are there to these theistic objections to the first premise of the atheist's argument? Okay? So now we're talking about responses to the objections to a premise in an argument. And in order to keep track of all this stuff, you've got to keep track of who's doing the thinking here. Are we talking about an atheist line of thought or a theist line of thought? We start with the atheist. The atheist says, here's why God doesn't exist, all this stuff about evil. And then the theist comes up with objections, like the free will objection to this first premise. And now we're going to talk about things the atheists could say in objection to the objections. It gets a little bit confusing, but I know you can do this. Okay, so let's start off with the free will objection. What are some atheistic responses to that objection that make sense? Now, one of them, this is a very obvious one a lot of people hit on right away, is that this whole thing about free will, it only accounts for moral evil, the kind of evil that is brought about by moral agents, people. But there's a lot of evil, and by evil I mean suffering. There's a lot of suffering that is caused just naturally by like natural disasters, like tornadoes and stuff. God could have brought free will into the world and still gotten rid of the tornadoes, and still gotten rid of the mosquitoes, and still, like, right? Like, why didn't he get rid of the naturally occurring suffering? The free will, the free will stuff doesn't explain that. And now, at this point, the atheist says, and here's another thing. Focusing on the moral evil, how does that get God off the hook? Like, God knows everything, right? Doesn't God know that, like, all the bad stuff that the free will would lead to? Like, really bad stuff? It doesn't seem like that gets God off the hook. One way to think about this is, who's to blame for the suffering in the world? And the free will objection is saying that, well, the people with free will, they're to blame. But wait a minute. Can't you blame the person that gave them free will? Here's an example. So suppose the president of a school handed out free guns to all the students, even though the president knew that, like, about 2% of any group of people, there's going to be someone in there that is not right in the head and wants to use those guns to do some real damage. Would the president of the school be off the hook because the students were using their free will to shoot the guns? You might say, if you were a parent of the students, you might say, no, this president is not off the hook at all. The president may have not known exactly who was going to pull the trigger, but the president did know, in a very clear sense of know, that someone would pull the trigger. There's very good reason for thinking that there's a non-0% of any given large population of people that are just going to do bad things. You don't maybe know which people it is or which day they're going to do it, but you do know they're going to do it, and you would be held responsible for any ensuing damages. So it would be immoral to release the guns like that, to hand out free guns in school, wouldn't it? You might say, man, I don't like your example. It sounds like you're against guns. But we could change the example slightly. What if the school was a preschool, and we're going to give guns to very small children? Even if you like guns, hopefully you think maybe you shouldn't give them to preschoolers. Wouldn't you think that? Wouldn't you think that? And wouldn't someone that did that, wouldn't they be responsible for what the preschoolers did with it? And if we're comparing God to a human being, isn't the difference between God and a human being even greater than the difference between an adult and a child that's in preschool? Wouldn't you say, you should have known better? Now, another thing that might come up, might be worth mentioning in this discussion, is we go back to this atheistic response, the one that says free will accounts for moral evil but not natural evil. Now, one thing a theist might say about that is like, well, actually, free will accounts for all the evil. Even the tornadoes are caused by people sinning. God set things up in such a way, initially in the Garden of Eden, where there wasn't any natural sin. There was no natural suffering. And then Adam and Eve, they went and ate the apple, naughty, and then now not only is there a bunch of sin being committed by moral agents, but also God created things like earthquakes and thunderstorms. But it's Adam and Eve's fault, not God's fault. Or you might bring the devil into it. The devil is using the devil's free will to make the tornadoes or something like that. Let's skip for just a second. Never mind. Sorry. So back to the free will objection. So free will accounts for moral evil, but not natural evil. Is this something that the atheist is saying against this free will objection? It seems like a pretty good point. The theist might at this point say, well, I mean, maybe it's all being caused by free will. It's all moral evil. There's some people that say things like there's certain diseases that are caused because people sin. Or there's a natural disaster that happens in a city, and someone will say, well, it's because there's so many sinners in there. That's why there was this earthquake. But that still doesn't seem to touch this remark, which is to say that introducing dangerous agents is itself immoral. right? So you got God who creates this universe and he puts free will in it, and the free will just leads to all this suffering. It seems like it's on God. Free will doesn't really get him off the hook. Okay, let's move on to the soul making objection. So this is the one that said, like, um, by bringing some suffering into the world, it also brings some good into the world because, well, by having some suffering, you you you're in a better position to appreciate the things that are good. It also helps you learn good things. So, for example, sometimes you have to, as a parent, you have to let a young child get hurt. That's the only way they're going to learn. Now, you don't let them get badly hurt, um, but you got to let them burn themselves a little bit to understand that, like, yeah, you shouldn't touch the stove or you shouldn't touch hot water. You got to let them fall off of the chair to appreciate. Yeah, you shouldn't climb up real high because you let them get hurt a little bit. That helps them learn. Um, and also, like, by having children experience like really hard work, and then they can really really enjoy relaxation, right? So you make them suffer, or you cause them to experience suffering, but it's ultimately for their betterment, for their own good. They are able to better learn things that they need to learn, like that you shouldn't touch the hot stove, and they're able to appreciate things more than they otherwise would appreciate. They're able to appreciate, like, how nice it is to just like relax at the end of the day. They appreciate that because they've been doing chores for the past 16 hours. They really appreciate relaxation when you make them do some chores. And you might say that's the way God is. God is like a parent who is helping us improve, by, practicing some tough love. Now, one thing you might say is that God is overdoing it. Uh, like, you think of all the suffering that He brings about. Um, that's a lot of suffering. Like, there's some really really horrible things that happen every time someone gets murdered or tortured, raped. I mean, that's on God, and you're going to say, like, that's to help us. How is it helping us? It would be like saying, uh, you're going to take a little kid and you want them to appreciate their legs. You want to appreciate your legs and having legs and being able to walk. So you're going to break their legs with a baseball bat so that they appreciate, once the legs heal, how nice it is to have legs. That would be really overdoing it. Um, and and still, you're not and even if you did that, you're not causing anyone to die. But God, in contrast, is creating a world in which thousands and thousands and thousands of people die. So isn't He overdoing it? Um, and also the examples where you're talking about learning something, right? The only way to learn how nice it is in the tropics is if you first grow up in Michigan. The only way to learn how good it is to relax is if you first work really hard. Well, that's a fact about human beings teaching other human beings. But what about God? God's all powerful. Couldn't He just beam the information directly into our heads? Uh, like, just make us appreciate the tropics without ever having to go to New Jersey. No offense to New Jersey, but, like, couldn't we skip it? Couldn't we skip being sick and just know how good it is to be healthy? Couldn't we skip having our legs broken and just have God immediately, like, beam the information into our mind about how to appreciate health? Uh, I have to let a child burn themselves on the stove a little bit, but why couldn't God just make the kid know that without having to go through the learning process? He's all powerful, isn't He? Why couldn't He do that? Okay, the best of all possible worlds objection. Um, there's a couple atheistic responses to that are worth knowing about. Suppose it's true that this is the best of all possible worlds, uh, then that raises the question of, what's the point of doing anything? isn't, I mean, so much of what you do and what motivates you is to try to make things better, right? One of the things that you're trying to make better, I presume, is you're trying to make yourself better. You are a student, you're trying to educate yourself, you're trying to make yourself better. There might be other ways in which you're trying to make yourself better also. Maybe you're trying to make yourself more physically fit. Maybe you're trying to make yourself a better friend, a better family member. Maybe you've got various flaws that you're trying to improve on. You're trying to become a better person. Um, Many of us have had, are recovering from histories of substance abuse. We're, just, we're trying to become better. We're trying to like be sober, and we're trying to improve the lives of other people. Some of us do charity work, and we're trying to help people have better lives. You might go work at a soup kitchen. You might help give meals to homeless people. You might go visit an orphanage and read stories to the children there to cheer them up and help them have a little bit of a better life. So we are all, in some way, trying to make things better. But if we're already in the best of all possible worlds, then what's the point of that? Right? What's the point? If you're addicted to heroin, what's the point of, right? If you're an alcoholic, what's the point of becoming sober? It's already the best of all possible worlds. So you might say that this removes all motive for trying to improve things. This makes moral progress impossible because we're already at the best that we can be. But there's a bigger problem for the best of all possible worlds objection, and it's that there's no independent reason for believing that this is the best of all logically possible worlds. If you just look at the world while being neutral about whether God exists, what reason do you have to believe that this is the best possible world? What seems more reasonable? Leaving aside the possibility that God exists, leaving that out of it, just looking at the world itself, what's more likely? That it couldn't get any better, or it might get at least a little bit better? What seems like more reasonable? In order for this to not be the best of all possible worlds, all you need is for it to be logically possible to be slightly better. So, for example, a world just like this one, except this one particular dude on this one particular day got a little bit more enjoyment from eating yogurt. That would be a slightly better world than the world that we're in now. That's possible, right? Well, why didn't God do it? Why didn't God let Larry have a better time when he ate a yogurt cup during lunch? Why? Why are you taking it out on Larry, God? So this point is that there's no reason to believe that there is the best of all possible worlds. That's just something that the theist is making up. And would make sense to them because they already believe that God exists. So, like, yeah, right. If God existed, then he would create the best of all possible worlds. And if you had independent reason for thinking that God existed, then you would have reason for thinking this is the best of all possible worlds. But in a debate between the theist and the atheist, it's just not plausible that this is the best of all possible worlds. It's not something that the atheist would grant. It seems obvious that until you bring God into the picture, that there just is no reason to think this is the best of all possible worlds. It seems obvious. There's all sorts of ways in which it could be better. And to go back to this earlier point, there's all sorts of people that are striving to make it better. The very striving of anyone that's trying to improve their life or the lives of others in any way just presupposes the assumption that we're not already in the best of all possible worlds. Okay, this could go on for hours and hours and hours, and I certainly would enjoy that because I love talking about philosophy and could talk about it 24/7. But your attitude might be slightly different, so let's wrap this up. Here is a summary of the main points that we were making in a graph form. So we've got these columns, and this far left column is the each of the theistic objections to the first premise of the argument from evil. And then in this column, we've got a brief description of each of those objections. And then in this column, we've got some atheistic responses to those theistic objections. Let's do some study questions. Study question number 1. The idea that a causal chain cannot extend infinitely into the past is more relevant to the cosmological argument than to the argument from evil. True or false? Study question 2. The free will objection to the argument from evil is supposed to show that the first premise of the argument, if God exists then no suffering exists, is false. True or false? Study question 3. The following argument is valid. If God exists then no suffering exists. Suffering exists, therefore God does not exist. Is that true or is that false? What do you think? Well, I'll tell you what I think. I think that they're all true. That's what I think. And I'm probably right about that because I wrote the questions. So take it from me. Those are all true. Unless I made a mistake. I mean, I'm not the best of all possible professors. I could have made a mistake. But I'm gonna say those are all true. And that's what you should say also. Until then, till later, this has been the end of the lecture. Okay, everybody, I will talk to you in the next lecture.